Evening all. I wonder if you've been celebrating VE Day today. A lot of people have been. There's been some commemorations and celebrations, even a few street parties. There's one being in my street. People got together under the social distancing rules, but were able to have a bit of a chat and commemorate today. And I thought, in my way, I would talk about a man who made it all possible. A man called Alfred Coady Wedermeyer. I think I pronounced that right. Who was he? Well, he was in 1941 a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and he was appointed to the War Plans Department in the Pentagon. Or I don't think the Pentagon was built then, but the U.S. War Department certainly. And back then, in the 1930s, the Americans had something called the Rainbow Plan, which was contingency plans for war with practically any country that America could conceive going to war with. That included Britain and Canada as well. So they had a contingency plan for going to war with Nazi Germany as far back as the 1930s. But when Wedermeyer got hold of the plan and reviewed it, he found that there were a lot of things wrong with the plan. And so he decided to rewrite it and submit his proposals to the US War Department in the hope that they would be approved. Now, what made Wedermeyer a remarkable officer was not that he had a great grasp of strategy, which he had, but he also understood economics and industry. He was very well read and well versed in world politics, understood economics, and in the 1930s he'd even gone to Germany to study in the German Army Staff Academy, where he did very well. So he comes back with all this knowledge, and he knows all about Blitzkrieg, and he knows about the German war machine. So he revises the plan for war against Nazi Germany, and in effect also revises the plan against war with Japan. Now he reckons that with the there's difficulties with fighting a war against Japan is that so much war material has to be built to fight Japan, because it's going to operate across the vast Pacific Ocean. A lot of island campaigns will have to be fought. So a whole lot of equipment, particularly ships and landing craft, have to be built. Whereas logistically, war against Nazi Germany isn't as difficult to assemble the material. He understands that both the United States industrial capabilities are vast. That with all the factories and the manufacturing companies, they can produce the war material. But he also noticed that Britain was also out producing war material over Germany. Not a lot of people know that Germany lagged behind Britain in World War II in producing war material. So his idea, he understands that Britain and the United States have this huge advantage over Germany, and that is they're more economically self-sufficient, and they control more of the necessary trade, logistical, and supply routes than their enemy. Germany is dependent for most of the war on the Romanian oil fields, but then they're really desperate to get hold of the Russian oil fields in the Caucasus. That's why there was the big drive on Stalingrad. And when the Germans couldn't capture Stalingrad and win, that was really the signing the death warrant on Nazi Germany. They could not win the war at that point. And we're talking about autumn of 1942. Autumn going into winter of 1942. Wedermeyer knows that Britain and the United States can, with their trade routes, as long as you can keep the U-boats and the German Navy at bay, and by the time late 1941 going into 1942, the strategy, tactics, the convoy system, and the anti-submarine tactics that the Royal Navy were using were proving to be very effective. They would be adopted by the United States Navy. Brazil also joins the war in 1942, so that means that stuff from South America can get to Britain and America a lot easier through the sea routes because now Brazil is hunting down U-boats as well. So through the British Empire and through the American trading networks, those two countries can control the supplies and logistics and outproduce anything that Germany makes. Wedemeyer is counting on the productivity and the industry of Britain and America to massively outproduce Germany in war material. This influences policy on what equipment is going to be built. Fortunately, in Britain, the Royal Air Force does very well. It's got a strategic heavy bomber, the Lancaster. They don't need another one. They've got a good light bomber, the Mosquito. They've got the fighter that they need, the Spitfire. So they can centralize production around those things. The army is a little bit more hodgepodge for Britain, but by the time they really need to put a large field army into Europe, they're kind of standardizing around a few set vehicles. The American industry is, when America enters the war, their main tank is the light M3 Stuart light tank. They've got that deployed in the Philippines. They also have the Grant tank or Lee tank, but that's not the one that's going to win the war. They have this design, prototype design that is approved in early 1941. That becomes the M4 Sherman. That's going to be the vehicle that will carry the United States and Britain and Canada and a few other allied nations to victory in World War II. Now, a lot of modelers, war gamers, gamers in general, don't like the Sherman. When you're playing these kind of battle games, whether on the tabletop or online World of Tanks, everybody knows the German stuff's a lot better. Well, it isn't. Because, yes, the German armour is thicker on their tanks, the German guns are more powerful, and their rangefinders are top quality as well. And the myth goes that you hit a Sherman, it blows up, it catches fire. I would like to point to the Chieftain's done a very good video on myths of American armour, where he addresses some of these and dispels a few myths. Now, the reality is there really aren't that many Tiger tanks. There's a few more Panthers, but most Allied servicemen are just not going to see those vehicles when they get into combat. What they see, they always misidentify. Every enemy tank is a Tiger in an Allied tank crew's eyes. They're mostly up against Mark IVs, which the Sherman can deal with pretty well. But it's the myth of the Tiger. But what happens is that the Americans can produce far more of these Sherman tanks. And here's a myth that I want to address, that a Sherman tank gets hit, it catches fire, the crew die. Actually, it was very easy to get out of a Sherman. It's one of the easiest tanks to get out of. Sherman gets hit, it starts to catch fire. The crew, if they have survived impact, can get out of that tank in under 5 seconds. So looking at the data, if you look at the raw data of crew survivability rates in World War II, the Sherman comes out pretty near the top because it is easy to get out of once it's hit. And that crew can walk just a few miles to a depot where they can get a replacement Sherman. Now, the thing is about the Panther and the Tiger is that they're great tanks if they can get to the battlefield in the first place. They were very high maintenance. They broke down a lot. They required a lot of servicing. They were more difficult to build because the Germans had a system where one company would build the turret, one company would build the engine and the chassis, one company would build the optics, and you had to transport them and then all assemble them together. With the Sherman and also with the British tanks in World War II, one factory is making everything, all the components for it. So there's a different section of the factory producing it. So it was easier to produce a Sherman. Also, you could drive a Sherman pretty well. It had good endurance. It didn't break down a lot. When it did break down, you just took out the broken bit. With the German tanks, you had to kind of dig a pit underneath the tank and then sort of, like if you had a broken transmission, you'd have to pull the tank apart, stick in the new transmission, then rebuild the tank. On a Sherman, you just had to open up the appropriate hatch on the tank, take out the broken part, drop the new one in. It's ready in hours to go back into action. And that's a huge advantage. So Wedermeyer has this plan to build a large mechanized force of reliable, easy to maintain vehicles that have got good endurance and can do the battle part fairly well, just well enough. And that's what they end up designing. Now, fortunately, the British are the only other army. The United States and Britain are the only two armies that are fully motorized or mechanized in World War II by 1942. The Germans, all throughout the war, this is another myth about the Germans, that they were all vehicle army. They weren't. Most of their infantry marched on foot or were horse-drawn. Their artillery was mostly horse-drawn. These images that we have of the Germans tooling around in half-tracks, that's only for a very small section of the German army. They were not fully mechanized. And their vehicles are more complicated. So you have Wedermeyer's idea of all motorized, mechanized force that can move quickly across ground. But where is that ground going to be? Now, the British were advocating for something they called the soft underbelly of Europe. So they were going to chuck the Germans and the Italians out of North Africa, and then from there go up through Italy and also through Greece, going into Yugoslavia, because there's an instant partisan army led by Tito that they can call upon, and go up that way into what they call the soft underbelly of Europe. The problems there is that with the Russians to the north and, say, Britain and the Americans in the south, it produces a north-south front, which the Germans would find easier to defend. Their armies can mutually support each other. Yes, all the Allied armies working together can do that as well, but America's got further to travel to transport its material, and Britain as well, getting it right across the Atlantic, then all the way through the Mediterranean over to the other side, whereas the shortest route is just to go from America and Canada over to the United Kingdom, then into France, boom, then across the land. Also, the southern European terrain is very mountainous. It's easy to defend with a smaller force, as the British and Americans subsequently found out in Italy. Italy was a very tough proposition to get through and defeat the Germans. They land in September 1943 in Sicily, and it's not until right at the end of the war that they finally make it to the top of Italy and the border with Austria. It took them longer to do that than it took to get across Western Europe. So the British had to be sold on the plan, and through a bit of Russian pressure, the Russians were very keen on this idea of advance across France in the west, mainly because it meant that they weren't competing for Romania and Hungary in the east, Russia thinking longer term. But also it took the pressure off the Russians, that the German army would have to be, their attention would have to be forced in two opposite directions. So strategically, it made better sense. Once the British were convinced, it was all go. And from June 1944, in less than a year, this Allied army, motorized, industrialized, efficient army, can make it in reverse from 1940 in the Blitzkrieg and make it all the way well into Germany. And it is Lieutenant Colonel Wedermeyer's idea, and it had modifications along the way. He submitted this plan in September of 1941, just before America was due to go into World War II, before the attack on Pearl Harbor. So they had this plan, and it was approved by the top brass and eventually the President of the United States. So this plan of his was the backbone of the victory in Europe. So, what happened to Colonel Wedermeyer in the end? Well, having masterminded victory in Europe, in 1942, he was sent to the Pacific. And he worked alongside Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese as a kind of senior military advisor in that Pacific campaign. Did pretty well. but then was recalled just before Mao Zedong, as communists kind of stabbed the nationalists in the back. But to finish off with, now I've heard some people say that military history isn't important. It's frivolous. It's kind of rivet counting on tanks and knowing the calibers of weapons. But I'll say this about understanding this stuff. If you understand the Sherman tank, you understand how American industry and economics works, because it is the embodiment of the American industrial system as it was in the 1940s. You can learn a lot about the economy, the society, and the politics of a country by looking at its armed forces and looking at what those armed forces use. If you look at the German armor and the German planes, you can understand why German thinking in World War II was ultimately doomed. And if you look at the Americans through their weapons and their systems, you'll understand why they succeeded, even though you could argue that German generalship and the German infantryman was generally superior to his Allied counterparts, but he was ultimately doomed. And understanding the weaponry can lead to this understanding of the wider reasons why countries do what they do. They have what they have, and it's a reflection of their economic and industrial capability. So don't write off military history and knowing the details of tank. Not that I could tell you what the armor thickness on a Sherman tank was. You can look it up. It's out there somewhere. But if you study these things, even at that granular level, it can lead to understanding a whole lot more. So I'm going to sign off here. Good evening all, and I hope to see you again soon.